All right. Oh man. Oh man. So I'm going to call Mark. Guys, innovation here. Innovation at its best. If people could stop. Please, people, stop WhatsApping me so that they don't see you guys. So I'm gonna. Can I make myself smaller? Guys, here's Mark and I.
So what's our strategy now?
Are you watching yourself? This is great. Oh man.
It's conspiracy, guys.
I know. I think because even everyone, guys, our Zoom, I don't even think anyone's viewing yet. Like, I don't see any viewers, but it's being recorded, whatever. It seems, guys, I'm sure you can see that when you message me, it pops up on my screen. So let's not and say we did. Nonetheless, oh, man. Nonetheless, guys, this is Siren Sundays being very innovative with Mark Daniels. Holler.
Hey, everybody.
So I'm hoping people can hear you. Let me actually cut my fan off to make that a little easier. So today we are talking about which pine is fine. Mark, we've had you on the show before, but if you could just quickly say who you are again. One of my favorite botanists in the Bahamas. Ethan too, but both of y'all.
Yes, the great Dr. E. Hi, everybody. My name is Mark Daniels. I am a botanist by training. I spent a lot of time working in the native habitats of the Bahamas, working with the Bahamas National Trust, the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve. I love all things plants, and so one of the things I love to do while working with BNT and the preserve was chop down casuarina trees, and not just because it's fun. It's because it's necessary, definitely in certain habitats. So I'm happy to come and talk about all things casuarina and promote our Bahamian pine.
Lovely. Okay, so things seem to be up and running. Hey Fallon, hey Bachancia. So just to speed through, I know we've lost so much time with these technical difficulties, but the Mandem can't keep us down. We are here and we are doing it. So a lot of people look at the casuarina tree that line our beaches that are basically everywhere. I feel like you cannot take a few steps in near any coppice forest or any coastline without seeing the casuarina tree. But can you just quickly tell everyone the two species of casuarina, because I think people think it's only one, that are invasive in the Bahamas, and just what an invasive species is, especially in the terrestrial environment?
Okay, well, I guess I'll just start with invasive species. So when you hear the word invasive, it doesn't refer to the origin of that plant. It refers to its growth habit and its reproductive capability. Usually the term described is invasive alien species, and that describes plants that are non-native to the Bahamas that have this invasive kind of growth habit. So casuarina falls into that category of an invasive alien species. We have a number of species that are native to the Bahamas that may be weedy, but it tends to more often be that alien species or exotic species are introduced to a new environment, and now we're talking about the Bahamas as a new environment, that they would exhibit invasive behavior where they reduce the biodiversity of the habitats that they colonize, and they usually do it in a way where they're either overwhelming the native flora or fauna that's there, or actively suppressing them through some sort of chemical means, physical means, or whatnot. So in the Bahamas, our two species of casuarina is Casuarina eccentrifolia, and then there's Casuarina glauca. So interestingly enough, the genus Casuarina was given to the plant to signify its drooping, quote-unquote, leaves, which resemble the cassowary bird. So I don't know if you guys have seen a picture of this large flightless bird with kind of like a blue face, and so it's a shaggy black feathered bird, and the feathers of that bird are droopy, and so it having the genus, I would say Cassora. I'm not an ornithologist, so don't quote me directly, but the name Casuarina refers to the droopy feathers of the cassowary bird.
It does?
And Echinacea refers to the nature of the quote unquote leaves to look like that of the horsetail plant. And if you Google Echinacea, you'll see how that resembles the casuarina leaves. So usually these are the ones that are the lighter, I guess, on a hue of green, a bit more erect leaves and branches. The other casuarina glauca tends to be a bit darker in the leaves and has more of a droopy appearance. It has the leaves a bit more dense and they sucker at the root more readily.
Mm. Awesome. And I think the first time I actually saw, and I'm going to call it Casuarina G because I think Glauca?
Mm-hmm.
Right. The first time I actually saw one of those was on the island of Eleuthera. It was actually in an area, it was almost like a dirt road. And when I saw it, I was like, what the heck? We actually have two species of Casuarina. Because is there a reason for that, you think, that we see the the Casuarina E more?
I'm not knowing, going into an in-depth discussion, I guess, of the biology, but it tends to be that the Casuarina glauca, especially on Eleuthera, if you go into rock sound, you can see that tends to be more along the roadsides. Casuarina echinacea along the coastline. Whether or not they have different salt tolerances, I'm not aware of, but I didn't study casuarina all my life. However, the plant in and of itself is tolerant of poor soils, and one of the reasons that it's utilized in other countries and other places around the world as a plantation tree. You have places where they plant plantations of casuarina to use it for fuel wood, for posts and pilings, basic construction material. And the reason it's used because the plant, casuarina, fixes nitrogen in its roots. So you can plant it in poor soils and it will add nitrogen to it that will help to feed into those casuarina population. So that's why they love our beaches, where there is some nutrition there, but it's not as rich as you would say the coppice forest. So between being able to take advantage of poor soils and also the dynamic nature of the coastline, they love disturbances. So whether it's a part of the coastline that's been recently washed away in a storm, or it's a coastal area of land that's been bulldozed, the casuarina will find itself in those habitats.
That's interesting, especially when you mentioned the part about it being used on plantations. How do you know the history? Like, how did casuarinas even get to the Bahamas? Who brought them here, and why?
Who brought them? I'm not pointing any fingers. But it's, there's research that's been done that said casuarina was the first introduced to the West Indies in the late 1800s, early 1900s. When you read the documentation on it, it was used as a way to stabilize dune or coastal ecosystems, but also just used as a source wood for fuel and construction materials. It's also been documented its introduction into Florida for those same purposes, especially for stabilizing dunes. At its young stage, in its younger years, the roots, it forms a nice tap root, which, if planted in, I guess, a specified design, would add some stability to a dune system that is, I guess, devoid of plants or any other structure. And because sand would basically be inert or very low in nutrients, it was an ideal candidate. Once they get larger, their root structure changes, their weight on the roots changes, and those sandy substrates in the coastlines are unable to hold those roots in the ground and keep that tree upright. So that's why in rough weather you tend to see erosion happening beneath the roots, and eventually trees tend to topple over in rough storms. So the story is it was brought in to do something good, and then it broke out wild after that.
As most of these bad things happen, they are always with good intentions initially, right? Whoever's good intention.
Both the pollen and the seed are spread by the wind. And so whether or not somebody brought a plant over and planted it somewhere on Grand Bahama, or that through wind dispersal, some seeds found its way over to the Grand Bahama shoreline, and was that the beginning of it? Who knows? Because there are some parts of there's some islands in the southern Bahamas that have no casuarina, and whether that's because the seeds haven't traveled that far, or the habitats are not accommodating enough. You have rougher shorelines, not as much sandy beaches. When you go south, the vegetation there, they go through a lot more, and so maybe that's the reason. But if you go far south in the Bahama archipelago, you'll find some islands and keys that have no casuarina. Very few.
I mean, everything rough in the south, eh?
I know.
I feel like
you gotta be tough to live to survive in the south.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really quickly on the point about seed dispersal. So people are aware. The seed is it in the little cone piece that drops on the ground and stabs you in your foot?
Yeah, so that cone-like structure will contain up to thousands of seeds, and you'll see the parts that stick you, when they're closed, there's a little suture line that ruptures and releases the seed. So it's a very prolific seeder, which is usually one of the features of any invasive alien species, is that their reproductive capability outpowers or outperforms, or however you want to describe it, that of the native species. So casuarina is one of them. Seeds a lot.
Nice. And I know you mentioned quickly how it stabilized the dune when it's younger, it's a taproot, so it can stabilize then, but as it gets older, it's very detrimental. That's what you said, right?
Yeah, so just the structure of the trees against all of those roots in our climate where we have thin soils, the root structure will remain mostly at the surface. If you were to plant a casuarina tree in the middle of Australia or Brazil or somewhere else where the soil conditions are different, they're not as acidic, they're deeper, the water table is different, then those roots would grow differently. And documentation of plantations on sites in Africa and in Australia and parts of Asia have shown that the morphology slightly changes. So for us, when casuarina grows here, there's this shallow root system that doesn't penetrate very deep.
And the common name for this is Australian pine, right?
Australian pine, beefwood, she oak. There's beach pine. There's a number of names for it. And then over, here in the Bahamas, most people they call it cedar.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and so not to be confused with cedars and the juniper. Botanically, that's what we would understand cedar to be, but that's the thing with common names. They change from place to place. So most people would look at those and call them cedar.
Right, and I know I'm going to have to plug this in here, and I feel like my friend who was with me this day is watching. I've already not liked invasive species, but after doing 5 seconds of a walkathon and spraining my ankle on a casuarina tree root, I've become very adamant about the removal of casuarina trees. And I know that when, I think it happened off the Eastern Road, the government cut down like a bunch of casuarina trees. And people were like, there was an uproar because everyone was like, why would you take away these great trees that we love having here? Can you maybe justify why that was good ecologically and maybe suggest, are there better trees that we can put there? I mean, there should be, but what are the better trees that we can put there to kind of achieve the same concept of the shade, minus all the needles and the sticky cones and seed dispersers?
Yeah. So, what you've seen there is similar to what would have happened at Saunders Beach a number of years back when those casuarina trees were being removed. And what you saw was a I would say a clash, but an opposition of views from those who are thinking of the biology and the ecology exclusive of the human interaction, and those who are mainly thinking of the human or the sentimental value of these trees. So most of us who have grown up in the Bahamas who are less than 50, 60 years old have, I guess an ingrained image of casuarinas being the tree that's on the beach. If nobody told you that it was invasive, you wouldn't know because like the shifting baseline concept describes is that when you become aware or when you were born, your beginning starts then. And you only really refer to that point where you started, and unless you search back in history, then you won't understand what the baseline was before you got there. So for us who were born on these islands and we met the trees here, we have a different perspective than someone who maybe was living here before the first casuarina even arrived, right, before the sand dunes or the coastlines were altered from this invasive species. So when you go on the beach, first of all, it's shade, so that's always a great thing. The sound that we hear, the wind going through the casuarina trees, a lot of people associate that's the sound of the beach. Most people wouldn't realize that that's actually the sound you're hearing when you sit in Goodman's Bay. It's just the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, and so that's an aesthetic that people enjoy. From an ecological standpoint, we discussed earlier how invasive alien species impact biodiversity, and the functional side of that is in a coastal environment, those plants, those native species, those sea grape and railroad vine and your sea oats and bay lavender and all those other plants that grow in that coastal environment, those are the plants whose root systems will help to stabilize that dune. Those are the plants that this is the environment they thrive in, they grow in, and they have a function and a purpose. Once, whether it's casuarina or some other factor removes it from the dune, it destabilizes it, and in this time where hurricanes are increasing or the strength of them increasing or the unpredictability of it, just over time, rough weather has in conjunction with the loss of the diversity in the coastal ecosystems, have led to coastal erosion. And you can look at certain parts of Grand Bahama, if you look at satellite imagery, where if you look back 20 years ago, the coastline in some parts of the southern shoreline of Grand Bahama was 10, 20 feet further out than when it was now. Some places even more so. We do understand that coastal systems are dynamic. There's a process of accretion and erosion that happens naturally throughout the year as the seasons change. However, ecologically on the land, you can see the impact of the casuarina. So for Eastern Road, that was definitely a project where the aesthetic value of those trees was really high. More so because the drive along Eastern Road is usually a very nice drive, a scenic drive for people to drive along. Yeah. Whether or not a tree is invasive, we as humans, we like vegetation. We like to see nice, we like to see old growth trees. It's just something about it that feels good. And when you go to a landscape that is devoid of trees and devoid of vegetation, that's, you feel that, or you see that. And so for those who have lived along the Eastern Road and driven there along that road every day for multiple years to and from school, the shade of the trees during the daytime when you drive to school, there's no sun in your eye, all that stuff is now changed, right? So you have to understand the human side of it, but also ecologically. And so if you look at parts of the Eastern Road where you see that pretty much there's no sand, the high water mark is feet away from the road, and in storms you've seen where other trees along that shoreline have toppled over. And so at this point, it's not just about cutting down the casuarina trees. The approach would be to rebuild the ecology of that system so that you're providing that protection to the habitats and the stakeholders that would be impacted by this lack of dune. Now, we also understand along the southern shores of the Bahamas, southern shores of Nassau, that the dune system tends to be lower. You find more of the sandy, higher dune beaches along the north shore of the island. So we don't expect there to be 30-foot dunes on the Eastern Road because, there's not 30-foot dunes at South Ocean or in the back of Seabreeze. There's a number of things that could have also attributed to that. The way we build and the way we clear down coastlines and what we do with wetlands. So all these things factor in. So for cutting down the trees on Eastern Road, that should be an exercise of we're moving these trees with a plan to improve the ecology of these habitats to prevent further coastal erosion. To me, that would be the objective. Right. There are also just some parts of that road that you probably will not get much vegetation there. You're pretty much sitting on dog-tooth limestone. It's being inundated during high tide and rough weather. And so a part of that is just also where that road was positioned initially maybe wasn't the best place. And so these types of discussions can happen all across the Bahamas in coastal environments, and how casuarinas affect roads, utilities, and housing.
Right. And so I want to try to tie 2 points in one to then segue into our beloved native pine. So the biggest, in my opinion, and I think it is, the biggest issue that we have with casuarina, one, it's a very strong tree. As you said, the wood is very, I guess, dense is the correct term, very strong.
Yep.
And because the roots are so shallow, when we have things like hurricanes come, the damage, not only to just the coast, which is very important, also to potential houses in the area is so high that I think a lot of Bahamians need to understand that if we still keep it very human centric, either way it's a win-win, because you need to get these out, because it can cause a lot of danger, especially with things like climate change, and we have all these superstorms happening. So to segue into the native pine, where are they most commonly found, and how do they stand up in regards to their root system when these kind of storms come in?
So our pine, our Bahama pine, our Pinus caribea and variety bahamensis. So you tend to find pine on what we call the freshwater islands, which would be the four northern islands, the Grand Bahama, Abaco, Andros, and New Providence. North Eleuthera is similar in habitat to those water islands, those freshwater islands, but there are no pine in North Eleuthera. And then you skip through the entire chain, the rest of the chain of the Bahamas, and you go to our cousins, Turks and Caicos, and then you find populations of pine there. So there's kind of a little anomaly there in the biogeography of pine. It's been explored by different researchers. So yes, the pine, they love freshwater environments, and not that they're sitting in standing freshwater, but they're in areas where the freshwater table is high, or the water table is high, within inches of the surface in some cases. And so for Grand Bahama, Abaco, New Providence, Andros, they're large freshwater lenses that support populations of pine, or pine forests. Those roots get well anchored. They go down through that dogtooth limestone to access the water. They would not have to travel as deep. There are instances where you see pine trees just uprooted from the ground during storms, and so you don't see that central taproot that anchors it down in the middle, unless that snaps off. I'll have to double check my root morphology. However, conceptually, pine should stand up well to hurricane, because pine as a species, or a genus or whatever, as a family, they're not heavily branching. So if you look at a pine tree, you see that a majority of its trunk is naked without any side branching, and then you get some lateral branches towards the crown of the tree. That means that during a heavy storm, that the wind has less surface area to push on for the pine. This is all conceptual. Hurricane Dorian rewrote the book for us.
Climate change.
With the pine being heavy in resin and sap, then it has a certain amount of bendability, you want to call it, where pliability, where it can bend and sway with the wind without snapping. The real issue when it comes to storms with our pine forest is saltwater inundation of pinelands. So you have areas where pine forests, they abut very closely to marine environments. You can go to places, once again, I keep calling it Grand Bahama, Queens Cove, where you can look across the canal, and there, as you step up off of the canal, you walk into pineland, and that transition you can see in many places in Andros and Abaco, and you can see the line where you go from a saltwater, brackish water habitat straight into pine park. Mm-hmm. During a storm, when you have storm surges and salt water getting into these habitats, pine does not deal with salt very well, and so pine tend to be large die-off of pine in areas where there's been extreme flooding after a storm, and water has sat and settled for a number of days. Depending on how long that water has settled, it would kill not only the standing pine, but all of the seeds and seedlings that may have been starting to germinate. And so what you see happening is this mass die-off of pine, and if the pine forests are rejuvenated, then it begins to get taken over by coppice forest species or invasive species.
Yeah. Um, Definitely. So I guess it's sad to say that that's where the casuarina kind of have our pines beat, where they can grow very close into the saltwater and the sand, as opposed to our native pines are more inland on those freshwater lands.
Yeah, they'll be, the pine and other species that that thrive in those pine areas. Thatch palm, they love fresh water as well. There being an abundance of fresh water around, so you're starting to get the ferns and a number of interesting ground orchids in the pine forest, and it's all due to the waterlands.
Yeah, and once again, there's another tree that just cannot survive the south. It's
Right?
rough down there. So, and I
Yeah.
know something that I actually had found out a couple of years ago when I started working at BNT that I'm not sure a lot of Bahamians knew was that we actually had like a logging industry with our pine, and from the dates that I like quickly found from 1905 until right before independence. So, do you know about the that era of the Bahamas where we actually had a different industry going on?
Yeah, in that time, there were a number of different industries that were uh, happening. Anything from also the farming industry, whether it was dairy, um, cows, or citrus.
You mean not only
Um,
tourism?
right, exactly. You know, yes, and so for logging, yeah, logging was active in the early 1900s in Abaco, Andros, Grand Bahama. Um, I'm sure it happened in Nassau. I just can't recall the reference from
It apparently
from
wasn't
memory.
wasn't as popular in New Providence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So and what's been said has happened was their strategy for cutting was clear cutting the forest and really only leaving behind the trees that were not desirable for market or for production, which is opposite to what sustainable forestry management principles would speak to, which is that when you're harvesting, you actually want to look for some of the best looking trees and that you intentionally leave those behind so that you're ensuring the genetic diversity of that population is intact. And so when that mother tree then seeds, then you're looking for that next succession to have similar or the same characteristics as the mother plant or the mother tree, which if it was a nice straight trunk, rot resistant, no disease, all that stuff, then the next generations of pine should have followed suit as long as you maintain that methodology.
Right.
When you clear cut and you leave behind the stragglers, then the genetic pool is not as broad, so to speak, in terms of its fitness. And then at the same time, you also just had, since the forests were clear cut pretty much at the same time, you also had dispersal of seed from those trees happening pretty much at the same time. So what you see now in our current pine forest is I guess the epitome of competition, where our forests are overcrowded with pine individuals, and they're all competing for the same amount of water, food, and light resources.
Right.
So if we're all in a room, if you pack 100 of us in a room, and we're all eating off of one piece of food, we're only going to get, I guess, 1/100th of that food. So we're all going to show signs of wasting, and we're not going to grow to our full potential. But if you put two of us in there, and there's only two of us sharing off of that big lake, we'll get nice and fat. So same concept with the forest.
Right.
So you need to thin the forest to allow the resources to be shared equally between the individuals so that everyone has a chance to grow to their full potential, which then increases the value of the products if you're going for lumber once you harvest. And so that's all a part of sustainable forestry management, which I know the Department of Forestry has been actively pursuing and doing its research and engaging groups who are looking to help manage the pine forest, because especially after Hurricane Dorian, there's been a number of areas that have been devastated in terms of the pine reserves, broken trees, completely uprooted, and not only has it damaged the populations, but it's also wasted the resource. And so right now, you would have persons that are harvesting dead pine to process and utilize, whether it's in the agriculture industry, landscaping industry, whatever products they may use. Right now, that's something that is a wasted resource that the hurricane has added to our list, I guess, of wasted resources from that storm.
Right. And I know another thing that I read about our pine is that it was used to make turpentine from the sap.
Turpentine.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah, turpentine.
And for the people, what is turpentine?
Boy, y'all need to get a chemist on here, right? But now,
Well, what's it used for?
As a young kid, as you get turpentine, there's paint thinner, right? So you had this big can of turpentine you use to paint, and so it's pretty much a solvent, right?
Fascinating.
And apart from that, there are any number of chemicals and byproducts you can get from pine tree, even just from its bush medicine usage. Like I have a former colleague of mine who lives in Andros, worked with the VNT for a number of years, who told us some secrets on what the pine sap could do for one's virility and fertility. So, and what the bush doctors over there will do for you. Take the pine sap, melt it down in some hot water, and you drink that as a tea. And now, this statement has not been evaluated by the FDA nor the Ministry of Health. But yes, you have those traditional medicine, traditional uses of pine.
Mm-hmm.
From the sap and other products.
And I know I read another use of our pine was to do charcoal. And I remember you and I had a conversation years ago about how the casuarina tree could also be used for charcoal. And I think casuarina is better for charcoal, no?
If I were to say what's better versus what's worse, I would say ecologically, the lower hanging fruit would be to use casuarina as a source of fuel wood. One, just because of its abundance. Two, it's already a plant species that's identified as part of the National Invasive Species Strategy to be eradicated from the Bahamas. So by mandate, we should be taking care of the casuarina problem. It's in abundance. It's pretty much everywhere. And so just in terms of, it being a lower hanging fruit, I would always promote casuarina over pine.
Right.
Not to say that charcoal cannot be utilized from pine. However, there are other products you can get from the pine tree which would have more value and I guess less ecological consequence by removing the pine. Because what you have now is you do have people that make charcoal from pine and also other coppice species. And in doing so, they're damaging that habitat because of improper practices. So right. Whether there's wildfires that are burning out, they're clear cutting large areas, or they're utilizing hardwood species that could be better used in the market rather than for charcoal. So right. I would definitely promote casuarina for charcoal, and it burns well when green. And it has a high caloric content, so it can burn dead hot.
Oh, nice.
And dead hot.
That's good to know. And I know one of the things, just in the the whole thought of the 100K tree planting initiative that the sustainable lifestyle is leading for the Bahamas. How would one plant a pine tree in their yard? Do I grab a cone?
Yeah, it's you got to know the technique to germinate those. I guess I wouldn't say the seeds.
Right.
Germinate those spores, right?
I think I have a picture while you talk about it.
So I am not a pine germination expert. However, the good folks at the Leon Levy Native Plant Preserve, they may have been experimenting with pine. Also, our good friends in Turks and Caicos, shout out Naki. I know he's been working along with the Kew Royal Botanical Gardens on a reforestation project for Turks and Caicos, which utilizes native stock and propagating native pine for their reforestation efforts. Mm-hmm. So maybe we need to bring Naki on here one day and let Naki do a pine germination planting workshop. But definitely once you get it germinated and you find the appropriate habitat for it, and once again, if you live in an area where there's pine around, then that's a good sign.
Is that a good picture of it?
You got a picture?
Is that a good one? Can you see it from the... Let me turn it to you.
Good. And see it. It's
I will forward it to
yeah,
you.
it looks like it.
Well, for the people.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the success has been in trying to transplant pine saplings or seedlings and like to dig them up out of the ground. I know they do have a taproot when they're young that you have to be careful of. That if you sever that tree won't survive.
Right.
And so it would be through germinating some of the propagated material from cones, and then making sure you're planting that in the appropriate location.
That's true. You did mention that it needed to have a freshwater lens. So it's not similar to like the infamous banana tree that well shoot that we talked about where you can guys kind of keep watering it, or is it something where the roots have to be able to go down into the ground and reach this fresh water?
Well, if you just think of their natural habitat, where they grow, that if you think of a cone that falls and let's say a small plant starts to germinate, when that initial taproot goes down, that's going to hit water within about 6 to 8 inches of the surface.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't need a deep root system. So if you're in an area where the water table is high, that'll probably benefit it. However, and also what you're watering it with is a big thing. So that's a whole other day of talk. But when you plant, when you're growing in your yard, whether it's you're doing native trees or you're doing a garden or whatnot, your water is important. And so whether or not you're using city water that has high chlorine in it, or you have your house on some sort of filter that's balancing out those elements out of your water supply.
Mm-hmm.
Some people have plant stuff and they're trying to figure out why their plants don't live or thrive, and it could just simply because the water you're using from your house is too high in one of those elements, and it's usually chlorine is one of them. And so in the same tone, if you're using well water, be sure that your well is not salty or brackish. You live in a neighborhood that's near to a coastal area that's been kind of oversubscribed in terms of people using the freshwater lens, or had saltwater or seawater inundation in that area. A lot of the wells have gone salty, and so you're watering your plants with salty water. And so if you want to grow something in your yard and you seem to be having trouble getting things to catch, one of the things you can check is your water. You can do a simple water test of your water. Aqua does it. There are a few other labs that do it. Other than that, catch your rainwater. Make sure you have your bucket out and you got a system, and you have your cistern where you can catch your rainwater, because the rainwater is always the best.
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like just catch rainwater to help make sure you have the actual right environment. And I see 2 questions, so we'll jump to that because I know we're a little over. The first one was asking native trees that you can put in place of casuarina. If you could just name 2 good replacements to save time.
So if we think about it, we're probably thinking about a tree that's as big as casuarina to provide shade and some aesthetic on the beach. So in terms of our native plants, there aren't very many in that coastal environment that's going to get huge. Mm-hmm. You can get sea grape trees that grow up to 30, 40, 50 feet tall and wide that are huge. I've seen them in Cat Island. I've seen them in Long Island and in parts of Eleuthera, where sea grape trees can get really large in a coastal environment and provide shade. Other than that, other trees that are native that you can use, so you have like the what's called cordia, the Geiger tree, has a nice orange flower. That'll get tall enough to give you some shade. You have 7-year apple. Those at a mature stage will be tall enough to give you some shade. I have some of the other species that grow in coastal areas that provide shade, but they're not native, but they're not invasive. So you have like Orhinia, poor man's orchid that grows in coastal areas. You have seaside maho. I think there's a native variety of that. It's in the Malvaceae family, pretty much a seaside hibiscus. You have coconut trees, which some would say are native just because they're everywhere in our region.
And they're tropical.
And they're tropical. They're technically not native to the Bahamas, but we call it tropical. So coconuts would be a good option. Other than that, you're not going to get very many large shady trees out on that foredune.
Right.
Once you get behind that foredune and you start to approach a coastal coppice, then yes, you're gonna get things like large Joe woods. What is that? Sideroxylon americana. I can't remember the company name for that. But as you get into the coastal coppice and the bursaras or the gabalamies, those provide shade near to coastal areas, but those will probably be behind that primary.
Right. So awesome. So the next question is from Letitia Gibson. I think you and I both know her very well. Um, so, well, I feel like this looks like a doozy. So the question says, one, is there any technology you'd recommend to process casuarina wood for possible lumber use and making handles for handheld tools? I've heard the wood is very dense but splits easily when it's dry. I also know the Island School incorporated some lumber from their casuarina pine into their infrastructure. So how feasible would it be to use this wood for lumber, and how stable would it be? It's like a so how feasible
Yeah.
and how
So
stable when it dries?
yeah, so you have to work it while it's wet, for the most part, depending on what you're using it for. So in Trinidad they would use casuarina for light posts or utility poles.
Okay.
So the cracking that happens when it dries is usually cosmetic for a large enough portion, and so it wouldn't be good to use it as finishing wood, but definitely for like rafters or fence posts, railings for staircases, things like that. So if you want to turn it into a post, you would get a wood lathe, and you would turn it. And so you get these large machines. You take a chunk of the wood and spins it, and you hold sharp tool again. So they have a number of different shapes and sizes to create different patterns. And this is how you could like create a baseball bat and things like that. So
Okay.
you can create posts and fence posts from the wet wood. If you just use the full trunk while it's wet as well, you can put that on a sawmill or on a circular saw for planks to create benches and signs,
Right.
and rustic furniture.
And sculptures
And sculptures.
for our artists
yes.
out there.
Yes, we've watched Antonius Roberts create a number of wonderful sculptures with just a simple arborist chainsaw and a piece of casuarina trunk. So your basic woodworking tools. What was the second part of that question?
So it noted that Island School incorporated lumber into their infrastructure. So just how feasible and how stable would that industry be?
Right. So, it may be an industry that's more of a, subsistence industry that people locally just want to build in more traditional means using wood. You'd have to probably bring a carpenter on to describe the difference in building with casuarina versus, let's say, Abaco pine, and so
Right.
or Bahama pine. So you'd find houses on Andros and Abaco that would have been built from the pine there many years ago that is still standing up today. So if you wanted to compare using casuarina versus Bahamian pine, I would go with using Bahamian pine to build your houses in terms of the structural integrity. Once again, I'm not a carpenter, but I know that I've seen some pine houses standing for a long time once they've been treated well. The casuarina wood, it's still strong, it's still useful. It's just maybe not something you want to put on, as the
In your house.
facade of your house.
Yeah, let's leave it for the charcoal. And I would totally do Mrs. Shelley Camp Woodside at Injustice if I don't note that. And I'm going to try to say it sort of verbatim because she always would caution this when people would come up with this idea of, and I agree with her, so let me say that as well. It's not I'm throwing her under the bus for any of these ideas, but you never want to try and use something like an invasive species to start becoming an industry because your purpose to create that industry is to get rid of it. And once you've gotten rid of all the casuarina, you don't want it to now become a problem where people are like, we need to plant more casuarina again. And you begin this vicious cycle of needing to keep growing casuarina to keep this industry going. So I like that you said subsistence would be best because then it's small scale. People do what they want with it. And which actually, great. It segues into Letitia's other question about what message would you have for persons and groups that want to use casuarina pines as hedge plants on their properties if they manage to prevent the tree from going into fruit? Should they still remove it from the property? And what's the best method of getting rid of these trees?
So yeah, casuarina, not only here in the Bahamas, if you go to South Florida, it's used as a landscape tree. It decorates the roadsides and sidewalks and things like that. So it's useful as an ornamental tree. It has a nice look. In the Bahamas, it's not necessarily a roadside plant intentionally, but you do find that people use it as a hedge in their front yards. I personally don't mind the hedge because by principle, it gets trimmed enough to maintain that shape to prevent it from going to flower and prevent it from going to seed. So those who have their nice, 3-4 foot casuarina hedge, I ain't hating on you. Everything cool, but I would probably pay attention to the big tree across the street from you on the beach before I worry about your hedge. Right. Now, if we've gone across the whole Bahamas and wiped out every single one in every coastal environment, and now only your hedge left, now maybe then your head's gone, right?
Definitely.
But when it comes to casuarina, it's just about when you harvest it, you try to harvest it before it goes to seed, so that you're not spreading seed, or you don't want to harvest it or cut it down while it's seeding, because then you're essentially going to spread the seed further. And you could use a herbicide to prevent it from stump sprouting. And so you can have a number of methods of putting that herbicide on your tree. You could use something called a hypo hatchet. It's pretty much a hatchet with a little squirt attachment to it, so that when you strike the tree, it injects some of the herbicide into the tree, and you do a certain number of hits, and then they'll put enough herbicide in it.
This sounds like a Mortal Kombat weapon. Like, what?
And there's another where you drill an angle down into the bark, and then you pretty much inject some of the herbicide in there and seal it off with wax, or you just shave down the whole tree, and on the flat surface you apply the herbicide, and that should help to prevent it from stump sprouting, because it is a prolific stump sprouter.
Prolific stump sprouter. I feel like that was like a tongue twister just now. But so I see we have another question from Ancelino, Dr. Ancelino Davis. He says, I feel you can never wipe out an invasive species like casuarina, lionfish, or iguanas. We need the laws to prevent moving it and disturbing it. And where can I get a hypo hatchet, and which poison to use? And Letitia knows, yes, specifically green iguanas, guys. The green iguanas are the invasive ones, not the endemic. Just where can you get this hypo hatchet for the tree?
You can go online and find it. I think Forestry Suppliers is has an online presence where you can find all your gear for removing invasive species. And Lino, I agree. It's difficult to try to eradicate all. That's why it has to be strategic, and you find those that are at the highest risk of either damaging the ecology of an area or just the ability for humans to inhabit that area. So for the most part, if there's a casuarina tree that's next to a power line and running over in between a water line and near a gas line, then that needs to get cut down before it topples over, because that's going to cause money for everybody if any of those utilities get disturbed. And that's just a part of it. You have to prioritize and be realistic about it.
See, what I find interesting, just to backtrack a bit, so I guess this can trickle into more of, botany in a broader sense. What you were talking about with this whole stopping the seed before it goes to flower or seeds, how do you do that again? Like, you cut it before it sprouts? Or, like, how do you attack this tree to stop it from essentially, being reproductive?
Now, this is in the ideal sense, right? Because this tree is going to reproduce whether or not you come in to chop it down this week or next week. The tree would have probably already seeded and has thousands of progeny all over the island. So it's just a strategy. For example, if you've ever removed Brazilian pepper from a property, and Brazilian pepper, just like casuarina, is a prolific cedar. And, when you look at it, it just has thousands of that red fruit all over it. And so it's that decision of, am I going to chop this tree down now with all of these seed that are ready to go? And as I now drag it across the street, throw it in the truck, and then drive across Nassau with it, and then dump it at this other place, and somebody might take it and put it somewhere else, then I'm spreading more and more of the seed around. Or am I going to wait until this set of seed has just fallen beneath the tree, where it's already crowded and you won't have the seedlings popping up and damaging that environment further because it's already taken over? Then that kind of decision. Or, you know what, I'm just going to wait till I'm going to make sure I go there and there's no flowers on the tree. And so it's looking at it from that angle. You just don't want to be spreading unnecessary seed all around.
Yes, I think that's a life lesson for humans as well. Nonetheless, being in men. Nonetheless, I just sorry. Definitely. One of the things that I think is also something that I wondered that we could maybe give to the public besides jokes. How could a person, just as a regular person by themselves, obviously pre any initiatives begin, because like you said, it has to be strategic, how can they maybe remove efficiently invasives off their property? Well,
first it's, people need to know that these plants are invasive. And that's the first thing. I know that there are a number of nonprofit conservation organizations that have been working throughout the years to increase the knowledge of the impacts of invasive species on our ecosystem. Actually, when you mentioned the eastern road trees being chopped down, I was reading a lot of the comments that were being put on a Facebook thread, and you found that the dialogue was pretty balanced, and it was balanced by those who had a emotional or an aesthetic attraction to that tree, and then those who were educated on the impacts of invasive species. Right. And it created a dialogue. And once people are having a dialogue, I think that's the first step.
Siren
and not
Sundays.
People feeling like they're being, that they're not being attacked. That,
right.
Because they don't know that this is invasive, or they know it's invasive, but they still like the shade that the casuarina tree gives. Hey, you can't blame them. You know what? Not everybody wants to sit in the bracing sun all day on the beach, right? Some
just Botanist.
Some people want shade. So, so you have to understand that there's a dialogue there and that there's a human component to it. Other than that, places like the Levy Preserve have done a great job putting an online flora on that anybody can pull up, and they can just type in the common name of, let's say, casuarina, and they can see what it looks like and learn its habit and things like that. The forestry department have also put on a number of initiatives. The Sustainable Tree campaign have all been talking about this discussion of invasive versus native. So
right.
I would say get involved and just kind of get in the discussion. And once you learn about it, the simplest thing is if you live in a coastal area or if you go to a beach and you're walking down the beach and you see a seedling, just pull it up. That's one of the first things you do. Because we can go and chop down all the big trees, and we can spend the next 60 years chopping down all the big trees. But there are hundreds of thousands of seedlings that are right under that big tree, essentially in that same habitat, that don't get the same attention as a big tree. So if you want to do your part, pull up the little ones.
There you go. That's really good. When you're picking up your litter from the beach, pull up the little casuarina saplings. Right.
There you go.
So, I guess we'll touch on this the last point. I mean, we're a little over anyway, but I was just curious, and this just kind of popped into my head maybe minutes before this call, in the same vein of the whole climate change thing. In your opinion, based on what you know or what you can kind of hypothesize, or in that sense, when it comes to casuarina pine versus our native pine and the effects of like climate change, who do you think is more likely to be more resilient? Right. It was just a very curious question.
Well, this leads into that bigger discussion of the impact of climate change on ecological habitats. Mm-hmm. So let's just take one example of it. So we said earlier that the pine ecosystem is sensitive to salt water,
right.
seawater inundation, or increasing salinity. Mm-hmm. Conceptually, as the sea levels rise,
right.
so will the groundwater be impacted by the salt water in the ground, pushing the freshwater lands closer to the surface. The closer it gets to the surface, the thinner it then becomes, and conceptually there'll be a point where the freshness of the lens is impacted and starts to become a bit more saline or hypersaline or salty, just due to the rising of sea levels around. This is outside of seawater inundation and so forth and so on.
Right.
So let's say that happens, and now the pine, they in a particular area, they're not happy because they're sitting in salty water. They'll have some dieback. Where you find dieback happens, it presents the opportunity for either A, the coppice forest to jump in and say, "We'll save you, habitat. We shall grow forth our gabalamies and our pigeon plums and poisonwoods, and we shall grow a canopy, and we shall blossom into what you've been suppressing us from," right? Or that habitat is so degraded that the coppice forest is not able to replenish that, and then you have invasive species that say, "You know what? I actually can thrive there." So whether that's going to be the casuarina or the melaleuca or the Brazilian pepper, there's any number of species that will take advantage of that opportunity, and that's what it is. They're opportunistic and aggressive.
Yep.
So for climate change, if we see that habitats are going to be impacted, and habitats that get impacted potentially will be left devoid, that presents an opportunity for further spread of invasive species. And we're not even going into the other, I guess, factors of climate change that may increase the
temperatures,
the vigorousness of how these invasive species grow, or how they're spread, or things like that. That's just one example of habitat dieback and invasive species moving in as a result.
And, and I think, and that just makes me think about how big of a problem climate change really is. I think, and that might even be an idea for either the next episode or another episode in the future, because I know people talk about, oh, global warming. No, it's not just this global warming. We've moved away from that term because it essentially is this climate change where you have extreme temperatures, extreme storms, you have sea level rising, and you have all of these other things happening that have almost like this chain reaction, like just as simple as sea level rising. No one would ever think to say, oh, well, so that means salt water is going to get into the fresh water. And with these temperature rising, that's why hurricanes are getting worse. And it's so many things to think about when it comes to that. And when I asked that question initially, I hadn't even thought about sea level rise. I just was thinking about, oh, well, it's going to get hotter and colder. Like, how are the trees going to survive that? But it does open up that topic of we really need to become more conscious about it. My blurb.
And I think one of the things that I guess in my becoming aware of, climate change or what's happening in the Bahamas or what's to happen, a big part of it is understanding what has happened in the past, and not only in terms of geologic timelines for the Bahamas, but also for the planet. And you understand that the planet, that the cycles of the planet has gone through over the millennia, and I don't know, you hear people say, oh, the world is going to come to an end. I don't kind of can say the world's going to come to an end. Is that this planet is going to change, and there are those that would need to adapt to the change that the planet is undertaking. And we've seen it happen at different cycles before in our past, and both man and beast alike, if they want to survive, they'll have to adapt. And we'll just put it at that.
Yeah. And and one of the things that I had learned over the years is something that people don't really think about, because when it was said to me, it was just like an aha moment. Humans are the only animals that do not adapt to their environment. They rather change their environment. So people always think immediately when you talk about evolution, oh, people coming from apes, when really it's this constant adaptation to adjust to your environment. And that's the survival of the fittest. And that's where, if you can survive these hotter temperatures, you're most likely to survive in the future. And then, man, humans we gotta get ourselves together, It makes me think of that. Like, we constantly try to change our environment. We're constantly doing things to the environment for the benefit of people. Like you said with the casuarina, a lot of people were upset about the cutting down because of the aesthetic of it. And I would do also Ethan, Dr. Freed, and Injustice, if I don't almost kind of quote him. People always immediately think of plants and say, okay, which ones can I eat from? like, what can this plant do for me, you know? And that always stuck with me because it's true. I mean, and even when I first met you, the first thing I would ask you is, which one of these plants can I eat? Like, what does this taste like? Can I sniff this? Like, what are the things that these plants can do for me? And I think people need to understand, and even if you want to go and take from like biblical terms, which I know a lot of the Bahamas does, we are supposed to be stewards of the earth. We're supposed to ensure that the earth is functioning well without us intervening to the sense that we're now damaging it. And I think that's a lot of what we've been doing because we've misinterpreted the fact that we're supposed to be ensuring that, you know, the earth is doing well and we're just kind of messing it up. I feel like I just had like a little speech just now, like a monologue. Any thoughts? I took your breath away. Look,
No,
I
it's
feel speechless.
I agree. I agree with all of that, and yeah, I agree with all that. And you were chipping in and out in there a little bit, but what I would say, what you made me think of, is that, and this is why, you know, people have lived in tune with nature, and cultures and societies have lived in tune with nature, because you understand that survival is intimately tied to nature and what surrounds us. And even though we put up walls and we have technology and the so-called advancements of today, it really just boils down to that simple connection with nature. Because if the power shuts off and the supermarkets shut down, and we only have our hands and the clothes on our back, then the things that are most important to you, you're going to look around for it. You're going to look for water in the ground, you're going to look for food, you look for shelter, and all of these things are intimately tied with nature. Right. And so nature is not a commodity to be used. It is your nature is nurture. It's your mother. Yep. You should treat it kindly, because you live off of it. And without earth, you won't survive. Right. I'm a tree hugger. Sorry.
Definitely, and I think. And I like that we're like ending on a really good note about this, because even you saying that, I think a lot of times humans, people, we forget that we are not separate from nature. So we always like to say, oh, we need to do this for nature. No, we're doing it for ourselves as well. We are a part of nature, so we need to ensure that, you know, we're a part of this ecosystem, this big beautiful planet. Mark, thank you so much again. This was definitely, again, a beautiful episode. Unfortunately, we had all these technical difficulties, but I promise you we're going to have a proper call one day. I didn't forget that we want to talk about magical plants on one of these episodes, so I'm definitely going to get you on that for one of these. But do you have any final thoughts? Maybe something you want to say to the people about everything? Yes, final thoughts from Mark Daniels. Oh, I think there's a lag. No?
Just, you know, I guess to make it applicable to invasive versus native, you know, there's some people that would say that nothing is invasive and that nothing is non-native, because it's all one planet, and that things move around from here to there, and that it's all relative, that at some point something had to arrive from somewhere else, whether that's people, whether that's animals or plants. And so a plant may be non-native or foreign or exotic, but that still doesn't mean that we can't love it, right?
Right.
And that goes for people too. So let's love all of our plants, all of our people, all of our animals, except the really invasive ones.
Yes, the ones that are extremely detrimental. But I agree. And thank you so much. And that leaves me with my closing sentence. As a country and even as a world, we oftentimes think that we are separated by water, but it is really what connects us. Thank you guys for tuning in to episode 3 of Siren Sundays. Hope to see you soon. It's going to be every third Sunday. I know a lot of people were like, when's the next episode? It's every third Sunday. So the next one will be, I can't think of the date off the top of my head, the next Sunday from now. So thank you guys for tuning in. Have a great Sunday. I think I'm trying to end.